Hi, I'm Jack from Jack Bell's Photography. I recently flooded my housing and killed my Nikon D7200 and 60mm macro lens. Before replacing these items, I decided to look at what is currently available in the marketplace. So today, I'm going to be talking about what I'm looking for, and in particular, the usability, size, and cost comparison between two market leaders, the Sony A7 Mark III and Fujifilm X-H1. I'll also summarize my thoughts. Hi. Fujifilm and Sony are probably the two most innovative camera companies, certainly over the last few years, and they've both launched new models. The X-H1 from Fujifilm and Sony's A7 Mark III. Now, one's APS-C, one's full frame, but actually I think they both occupy a similar position in the marketplace. So I'm going to do a real-world bias comparison between these two models. First of all, let me start off with what I'm looking for. I mainly do underwater photography. I also enjoy landscape, street, travel, and occasionally even get invited to shoot people at small events. For me, the most important element isn't the camera itself, it's the photographer. The photographer is in charge of composition, framing, use of light, telling a story, and so on, and not the camera. The camera is a tool to help the photographer achieve all of this and be able to focus on the artistic element, the creative element of the photography, rather than think about all of the functionality of the cameras. So what are my main requirements? First of all, I want a small and lightweight camera. That's important for underwater photography because you end up with a housing and a load of extra gear, and sometimes you have to carry this a long way. I want good quality lenses. In particular, I need a macro and wide angle lens, but I also need other lenses. I like to shoot primes primarily. I'm interested in ergonomics. As I said, the photographer is the most important element. That means the ergonomics of the camera are perhaps the most important feature and function, a feature and quality. So I won't be looking at specification. There are plenty of review sites that'll do that for you. For me, it's more important how the key features can be easily accessed and when required during shooting. Also important is low light performance. It actually can be quite dark underwater sometimes, so it's good to have low noise for those black backgrounds for macro shots. IBIS could also be useful to provide steadier shots under these conditions, and good focusing is very important, and moreover being able to move that focus point easily and quickly to where it's required. Sometimes I place the camera in awkward positions to see, so what I want is a screen and viewfinder to have an equal performance, which is one of the reasons why I'm thinking about going away from DSLRs. And also, I need good battery life. Battery life is very important because if I'm shooting underwater for 3 dives, then I don't want to change the battery unless I really have to. So let me talk about some general considerations. So full frame bodies and lenses are generally bigger and heavier, aren't they? Sony lenses are expensive and not sure if I really need full frame. I've been using APS-C up till now and the quality's been perfectly good for my requirements. So let me do the comparison now. First of all, the two cameras share have quite a lot in common. Both of them have excellent functionality. They're great cameras, aren't they? They both offer plenty of customization. So however I want to set up the camera, there are plenty of buttons there so I can access key functionality quickly. They're also the latest models. Sony has a new sensor and Fujifilm's is a little bit older, but both are high quality sensors. So what about the A7 Mark III? Well, on the plus side, it's a full frame camera with excellent image quality. The lens lineup is excellent. It's improved over recent times, and there's quite a good lineup of lenses at different price points. Maybe not quite like Nikon and Canon, but it's a lot better than it used to be. The ergonomics are good. It's easy to change the main functions of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And there's also a dial for exposure compensation. The battery life is also good. That was one of the problems with the previous model, and that's been corrected. And that should easily be good enough for a day shooting underwater. What about the negative aspects? Well, the system's expensive. And I don't just mean about the body and one or two lenses like the kit lens. I'm going to go into this in more detail, but actually investing in quite a few high quality lenses is expensive. The G Master lenses in particular. Whilst the A7 Mark III is smaller than an equivalent full frame DSLR, it's bigger than other mirrorless systems. So that's another aspect I'm going to focus in on. And maybe the biggest weakness in the A7 Mark III is the menu system. It's basically pretty difficult. However, once the camera is set up, you don't really have to delve into the menu system so often. So, what about the X-H1? On the positive side, it's an APS-C sensor size camera. It's good enough for what I need. The ergonomics are really good. Actually, it's all the functionality being used by dials makes it a great camera to use and a fun camera to use. And that's important. It'll encourage me to shoot more. There's also a really excellent range of sharp and affordable lenses. What about the negatives? Well, the biggest negative that I can see is the battery life, and that really sucks. Around 300 shots, that's barely going to make it past 2 dives, and sometimes not even that. So that's a problem. Also, I would say from the reviews that the low light performance isn't quite as good as the A7 Mark III. The question is it good enough? So let me just look at full frame versus APS-C first. As I said, APS-C has been good enough for me. Full frame, what does that really give me over and above APS-C? Well, let's start off with, there's one-stop advantage. And I'm going to show how that may well benefit the Sony system pricing and size disadvantages. It's perhaps more future-proof so long as I can afford those GM lenses in the future. But it does have better dynamic range. That can be important in certain circumstances, and it does have better low light performance for full frame. So let me quickly go through the lens lineup. What I did was I took a selection of lenses, the Fujifilm X mount and the Sony A7iii full frame, and tried to pick equivalent lenses of each type. Trying to allow, in some cases, for the difference of the one-stop advantage for a full frame. So let's look how this lines up. So I've got for wide angle, I'm looking at the 16mm or 24mm equivalent in the Sony full frame. 2 options for the 23, which is equivalent to the 35mm. 2 options for 35mm, which is equivalent to full frame 50mm. Again, 50 and 56mm to give me that 85mm focal length for portraiture. Then obviously the macro lens is important to me. and then a couple of zooms, 18 to 55, which is equivalent to 24 to 70, and then the 15 to 140. And I've tried to give equivalent lenses in each lineup to do a fair comparison. So let me start off with a size comparison. So what I've worked out is a volume, and this is in cubic millimeters, but you can see the Sony is actually quite a bit bigger, maybe about 25 to 30% bigger in volume. And this is the volume of the basic camera chassis, excluding the grip. Then I've compared the lens lineup and worked out the distance from the back of the camera to the front of the lens. That's so the body plus the lens length. And you can see in the various lenses, starting off at wide angle, there's maybe 1.5 centimeters difference in total length, and this generally increases to about 4 to 5 centimeters. I've included the extended length for the two Fuji zoom lenses, but you can see once I add in the extra quality lenses, the high quality Zeiss lenses, they can actually be much longer, and in some cases almost double the length of the Fuji equivalent. What about weight? Well, weight actually, surprisingly enough, the Fuji X-H1 is a fraction heavier than the A7 Mark III, and that's including batteries and memory cards. For the lenses, it's not, the Sony lenses aren't automatically heavier than the Fuji lenses, certainly not at low quality, although when you start to take the higher quality Zeiss lenses, these can be considerably heavier. And so looking across the whole range, really looking at a kilo heavier for this lineup of lenses and camera. In terms of cost, what I've done is I've looked at the actual cost of acquiring both these cameras and lenses locally. I currently live in Southeast Asia, and these are the prices I have to use, but I've used the dollars, so perhaps easier for some of you to understand the comparison. Also, the A7 Mark III is in pre-release, so I expect that body to come down in price. But as you can see, again, it confirms my earlier suspicion. Some of the higher quality Zeiss lenses are actually considerably more expensive, sometimes triple the price of their counterparts. But in some cases, the Fujifilm lens is more expensive. So that's something to consider. So what about a real world comparison? Because you can take advantage of the one-stop improvement of performance of the full frame versus the APS-C. And perhaps this is more likely what I would purchase, or at least aim to purchase eventually. So what I've done is I've changed some of these lenses because Sony benefits from having a larger collection of lenses in their lineup. So for instance, you can use the 28mm f2 instead of the 35mm f1.8, and then use it in conjunction with a wide angle converter, and that will give a 21mm equivalent focal length at f2.8. It's not quite the same quality as the 16mm f1.4 from Fuji, but actually a pretty good option, and the 28 a very good option really, and perhaps comparable in performance to the 23mm f1.4. I've gone for the 50mm and 85mm f1.8 Sony lenses. Both are sharp, both are high quality, and perhaps a good match for their Fuji equivalents. Likewise, the macro, there's no difference in quality there. Maybe the 18 to 55 Fujifilm zoom lens is a slightly higher quality, but I don't really use the zoom lens. This is just for convenience at low-key events and really when I'm traveling. So looking at this, now the size comparison is a lot closer. In some cases there's a 1 or 2 centimeters difference, but actually there's not such a big difference as with the high quality lenses. Looking at the weights of the both systems, because there's one, I'm reusing one of the lenses, actually there's in the Sony lineup, now there's definite weight advantage to the Sony system. Also, looking at the real world cost comparison, now the Sony system actually comes in a little bit cheaper, and this just reflects the wider range of lenses in the Sony system. So there's quite often a lower cost option which I can use. What about other Fujifilm cameras? Well, if you compare the X-H1 to the X-T2 and the X-T20, the X-T2 is maybe 20% smaller by volume than the X-H1. The X-T20 is a lot. It's getting on for 40-45% smaller. The depth, there's not a lot of difference, less than a centimetre's difference between the X-T20 and the X-H1, with the X-T2 being somewhere in between the two. Weight-wise, quite a big advantage for the X-T20, getting on for 40% lighter than the X-H1, and the X-T2 is around about 25% lighter. And cost, again, that's another huge advantage for the X-T20. It's half the price of the X-H1 with perhaps the same image quality. So the ergonomics are slightly different, but there are some great YouTube videos on how to customize the X-T20 to make it really, really fun and really good to use. So what are my feelings, really? What's more my final thoughts? Both cameras are actually awesome, and I don't think you can go really wrong with either system. For the advantages for the X-H1, the ergonomics are great and it's fun to use. It's actually smaller and lighter than the Sony. It's a shame that there's no housing for the X-T20, because I would strongly consider that one for use certainly underwater. What about the A7iii? Well, I think it's got slightly better performance with more long potential for growth. However, I'm not sure that I would pay all the money for those G Master lenses. So how much real longer term potential growth is there? Also, the real world option really opened my eyes to the possibilities that, yes, the A7 Mark III and the real world selection of lenses still are bigger, but actually not heavier. No more are they heavier, and not necessarily more expensive either. So that makes the Sony A7 Mark III a real contender for me. So just to finally say, I think the key thing about either of these two systems for me is going to be the cost of the underwater housing. So that's one comparison that I've yet to do. But I'm pretty sure that the Sony A7 Mark III underwater housings are more expensive as the bigger full frame housings, and so are the ports. But the key thing is to get a camera system and go out and practice, because photography is a spectator sport. It's something that you improve by doing more and more. See you next time.